It's interesting to see. It's almost an even distribution of where the challenges are, and it just points out how many potential challenges there are and how much it requires groups to coordinate together to overcome them. And some of what we're going to be presenting today, it, by no way is it a panacea for all of the challenges that you're going to have, but some of how we've oriented these toolkits that we've been developing with this team is to try and reduce some of these barriers to project implementation.
And I guess one thing as well is kind of a unique one here is water rights is really kind of standing out as maybe the one with the most complexity or most challenge out of all of them. And that kind of echoes some of the feedback that's been given in prior working groups for Flood-MAR to kind of talk about, on the sciences side, there's a lot of great tools, a lot of great research, a lot of great understanding. And one of the more challenging pieces that a lot of practitioners deal with is this water rights piece. So that seems to be reflected in this poll as well.
All right, Luke, do you want to kick off the presentation? All right, thank you all for joining us today. We have a great attendance. Our topic today is very well timed with this really wet year. We're going to be talking about Flood-MAR and floodplains. So reconnecting the San Joaquin, which we also sometimes call the Resilient Floodplains Pilot Studies. This is one of a couple areas that we are looking at. This talk is going to focus on the San Joaquin. We've also looked at several other areas in the state. And we have developed a toolkit that has built on a lot of resources put together by the conservation strategy previously to identify, analyze, and prioritize multi-objective opportunities for floodplain rehabilitation. What that means is we're looking at opportunities to set back levees and modify floodplain topography to enhance connectivity, and then evaluating the potential benefits that we get. And we try and go from the really large scale, kind of very large reach scale down to evaluating conceptual designs for projects and seeing what the potential benefits are and how can we kind of build collaborative efforts where we get a lot of support for projects that can be advanced to implementation. I'm representing a large team here, or Luke and I are representing a large team from CBEC. We have myself and Luke, Chris Bowles, Caitlin Barnes, and Matt Weber. From Jacobs, Jeremy Thomas was really instrumental in getting us started, beginning with some of the work we did on the climate adaptation plan. And Deborah Bishop has more recently been leading our effort on the San Joaquin. We've also been working with CJ Porter. And then from DWR, last but not least, we have Jenny Marr. Have you heard of her? She's been amazing at getting some of these recharge concepts built into how we think about floodplain reconnection. And we have Lori Clamero-Chu, who has worked on it, not just in this kind of last couple of years on the San Joaquin, but previously in other efforts, helped to build these toolkits through managing some of these projects. And David Martesian and Chris Bonds as well. Next slide. So this year has really set the stage for this topic. We've had flooding in many areas that have overtopped levees and really pointed out the failures in some of our infrastructure, where we have very vulnerable systems that are built primarily to deal with flooding, but not necessarily with a thought of, what other benefits can floodplains provide. And that's something that the state recognizes really well. And I think a lot of the groups we're working with are working on planning on how do we think about reconnecting floodplains, building back resilient infrastructure, but it's a challenge. And I think a lot of that has gotten national media, right? You see podcasts, articles in the New York Times talking about how the state has historically kind of failed in flood planning, and that's kind of limited our opportunities to reduce vulnerabilities to things like the flooding that we might have coming from the huge snowpack this year. A lot of that has to do with our managing to a single purpose. If you go to the next slide, Luke. And really what we want to think about how we can improve in the future is coordinating flood and groundwater management, right? We know that we have our depleted aquifers. The last 5 years, we were dealing with droughts, and then we immediately jump into this flood stage. So how can we use floodplains and think about reconnecting them to, get water back, not moving or moving horizontally across the floodplains where we've kind of constrained them by levees, but also vertically into the subsurface. That's really important, and also has benefits for flood risk reduction. We can slow down the flow. A lot of our systems are pretty flashy, and we can get water out on the floodplain to attenuate those peak flows. We can take water off of those peak flows for things like AgMAR. That's been a lot of the focus of the Flood-MAR network, and think about managing our reservoirs differently. But with floodplain reconnection management, we have a lot of additional benefits. It's not just the flood risk reduction, it's the ecosystem enhancement, connecting areas for groundwater dependent ecosystems, disadvantaged communities. There's multiple benefits for these recharge basins and opportunities within the area that we can connect to our rivers, or I should say reconnect to our rivers. There's also the opportunity through working lands preservation, is we want to make sure that we're identifying areas that are key to recharge along riverways, because it's critical infrastructure for the state to be able to actually get water back into the ground. And we want to preserve these areas to make sure that's possible. Next slide. So a little bit of context for this study is the pilot studies are a partnership between DWR's Flood-MAR program and the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan Conservation Strategy. And we're building off work from both of those programs. So from the conservation strategy, we're building off a series of tools that were developed over a period of 10 plus years, the Floodplain Restoration Opportunities Analysis, or FROA. And as the first step in this FROA process, there was this concept of looking at using hydraulic models to predict the water surface elevations, and then projecting those water surface elevations out beyond levees or obstacles to see where there are areas we could potentially set back levees or modify the topography to create additional inundation. And where we've built onto that is kind of what is the potential in those areas? What kind of concepts could we develop? And what would be the benefits of those concepts for recharge and habitat? There's also the Flood-MAR program, and the research priorities of the Flood-MAR Research Advisory Committee there were some very specific objectives laid out that we've tried to fill out as we've developed these tools. So develop a tool to calculate groundwater recharge that occurs when floodplains are inundated, and then map and prioritize Flood-MAR based on additional habitat, map subsurface geology. That's a lot of what we will be talking about today. And then a big piece of this is it's not just these two programs, it's how do we align with other programs within DWR like Sigma, but also with other agencies and build support towards projects so that we can get things implemented. So how do we leverage funding across local, state, and federal programs? Next slide. So our objectives for developing this tool is we want something that is useful at really large scales, applied at the Central Valley scale. That was how the original FIP analysis worked, but is also useful for representing getting down to those project scales where we're actually thinking about implementing projects. So we want to identify the best opportunities, not only for inundation, but for groundwater recharge, ecosystem uplift. We primarily focused on salmonid habitat. We want to think about flood risk reduction, adaptation to climate change, be able to represent alternative management scenarios, and identify areas for potential alignment with other partners. And the last one, the most important one, implement projects or pilots, right? We want this to lead towards increased facility to implement these floodplain restoration and recharge projects. So the graphic on the right just shows the EcoFIP tool, which is kind of trying to tie together a lot of these different pieces. Next slide. And for the San Joaquin, we've done this work in two phases. The first phase is this large scale analysis of opportunities that we've identified and a prioritization. And then the second phase, we try and take those ideas and prioritization and take that to concepts that could potentially be implemented in the future. Next slide. And here I am going to pass it on to Luke to describe how we've kind of developed the tool as a process to accomplish this.
All right, thanks, Michael. Yeah, so as Michael mentioned, I'm going to be going through the EcoFIP tool and kind of tying it to these two different phases of the study that we're kind of talking about overall for the San Joaquin River. And to throw kind of another numbering convention at this, we break down EcoFIP into several different tiers of analysis because we want the tool to be able to start at kind of the high level and go from a watershed scale planning approach and be able to get us quickly to kind of high priority locations for floodplain reconnection based on multi-objectives like floodplain recharge and a lot of times salmon habitat, and then be able to quickly get down to actually doing conceptual designs on the ground. And so tier one is kind of that first level that we'll start with, which is kind of our large scale inundation potential. It's really kind of doing similar to what the original FIP was doing that Michael had introduced, really looking at what is our potential to get water out on floodplains if we were to think about where we might set back levees or do kind of large scale floodplain lowering or topographic modification. Once we identify where we kind of have that baseline potential, we can start to think about the multiple objectives piece. We can start to look at site identification, analysis, and prioritization by bringing in a suite of metrics that describe how useful that inundation is on the floodplains for recharge or for habitat, for instance. And then ultimately within those kind of high priority sites, we have a suite of tools that we use to then kind of game the system and say, what if we do these different types of land modifications and what is the amount of uplift that we'd be getting across those different metrics as a result of doing levee setbacks or floodplain grading. And so ultimately for phase one of the study for this San Joaquin project, we're really using these first two tiers of the EcoFIP analysis to get us from a 50-mile reach of the river down to priority locations. And then phase two was taking those priority locations into the conceptual design phase in tier three. There we go. So going back into tier one, this is really asking that question of where can we get water out onto the floodplain? And to do this, we're starting with a hydraulic model, a lot of times a one-dimensional model that is used pretty frequently for flood routing on a lot of these major rivers. And we're projecting those water surface elevations that we get from a range of flows that we simulate out over the floodplain, kind of going through levees or other topographic barriers to just ask that question of where could we potentially drive kind of gravity-driven inundation out on the floodplain. And so this animation is showing a portion of that for the San Joaquin River. This is within the leveed kind of agricultural reach and kind of in reach 2A, and we'll show some maps that kind of show where this is. But the animation is really showing a potential inundation footprint across a range of flows within kind of the hydrologic record that we're looking at. This is kind of a post-dam regulated record that really doesn't get up above 10,000 CFS really. So we simulate flows on here from 100 up to 15,000 CFS just to kind of look at where those potential inundation footprints are. But we also want to understand not only where is that potential inundation, but what is the connectivity of that inundation in the river. And so this is showing under existing conditions with the current levees and barriers in place. Areas in blue are physically connected to the river across a range of flows, and kind of going from the darkest blue being connected at low flows up into the lighter colored blues are kind of the connected higher flows. And all of these areas in green are currently disconnected from the river at those different flows. And so the ones that are kind of showing up in this dark green color are showing areas that would inundate under relatively low flows, but are currently disconnected from the river. In the upstream end of the reach, just below Friant Dam and Reach 1A, a lot of these are former gravel mining pits that are, have been excavated down, so they're relatively low with respect to the water surface elevation in the stream. And then we also have opportunities once you get out into Reach 2A, where there's kind of the leveed reaches where flood risk starts to become an issue. But we can also think of it in another way. It's not just where can water get under existing conditions or how connected is it based on how the system is currently built, but what are some of the opportunities we might have to do things like floodplain regrading or lowering or levee setbacks. And for those types of questions, it's important to look at height above river. Sometimes these are called relative elevation models or river elevation models. It's essentially a digital elevation model, except that instead of 0 being some datum like NAVD88, 0 in this case is the water level in the river at a particular flow. So this map is showing a 1000 CFS water surface elevation run. And anywhere that's kind of in purple or blue, anything less than 0 is below that water level in the river, whether or not it's connected. So we see a lot of these gravel ponds, again, are kind of lighting up as being purple. We start to see some of these areas down in the floodplain reach and Reach 2A as being kind of in this blue color, meaning that that would be below the water level at 1000 CFS. Some of these areas in greens are 0 to 5 feet above the water level. And then as we get into the reds, 10 to 20 feet. And a lot of these areas out here that are kind of shown in black are more than 30 feet above the river. So you get a nice sense of kind of how confined the floodplain opportunities are within the middle reach, when that opens back up into reach 2A where those opportunities exist, and get a sense of how much grading you might need to do if you were trying to get these different floodplains to reactivate at particular flow thresholds. And so all of that is kind of that tier 1 of the analysis, really asking where can we get water out on the floodplain. Then when we step into tier 2, we're asking questions like, how useful is that floodplain inundation for recharge or for driving salmonid habitat? And we're also going from just kind of a concept of individual flows. Oops, sorry, I think my screen went off there. There we go. Individual flows into time series calculations. So we can ask questions like how much, how many acre days of habitat is this reach going to provide in an average water year? And to do that, we have to build a series of rating curves to be able to go from this kind of flow-based approach into a time series-based approach. And it's really analogous to what's happening with stream gauge networks. And so if you think about, stream gauges that the USGS and other agencies have, they're out there continuously measuring the stage of the river a lot of times, or just the height of the water surface elevation, but they're reporting out continuous time series of flow. And the gauges themselves aren't really measuring flow, but they're really just measuring that river stage. And then they've gone out and they've derived these rating curves, essentially, measuring the flow at various river stages so that you can build this stage flow rating curve and ultimately derive a flow time series from your stage time series. And then once you have your derived flow time series, you can conduct statistics on that and generate metrics like the annual maximum daily flows or flow duration curves and things like that. And so that's really what EcoFIP is doing as well, where we're starting with a flow time series that a lot of times is coming from a stream gauge, but might also be coming from a modeled time series. And we'll talk a little later about using different hydrologic scenarios if we want to think about climate change or reservoir reoperation. But we're really starting with the flow time series, and we're building a family of rating curves at each location that we're looking at. One of these is a flow versus area rating curve to look at getting an inundated area time series out of this flow time series. Another one is a flow versus volume rating curve so that we can transition from flow to inundated volume. And then any number of flow versus weighted usable area or kind of habitat area rating curves so that we can describe the amount of, kind of the amount and quality of habitat for particular species of interest. And then once we have these initial derived time series, we can also combine, the inundated area time series with things like depth to groundwater, soils, and aquifer properties, something we'll talk about a little later, to get a recharge time series. And we can further, integrate those with groundwater models, and also looking at modeling flood risk reduction. So there's there's various time series that we're getting as kind of this first order from these rating curves, and then there's additional data layers that we're adding in here to get at some of these secondary derived data sets. And from all of that, we're able to get things like water year based or exceedance metrics for inundation, recharge, and habitat that we can then use to kind of rank different sites against each other and say, where are the highest priority sites to do some of this multi-objective floodplain restoration. What this looks like when we're actually building these rating curves is in this animation, it's kind of showing inundated area in the upper left-hand corner versus suitable area. So this is habitat suitability for rearing Chinook salmon in this case. Where is the high quality habitat out on the floodplains? And as we increase in flow, we're constantly increasing our inundated area. So we see this kind of blue line increasing as flow increases. Suitability for Chinook salmon is kind of based on the depth of flow, the velocity of flow, timing, duration. And so there's a few variables that contribute to what makes good habitat versus poor habitat. And we're actually ending up in a situation here where as we get higher and higher flows, we're drowning out a lot of the habitat as it gets too deep, and we're kind of moving that high quality habitat up into the fringe. So you can kind of see that as flow increases, in this particular case, we reach some kind of intermediate optimum habitat. And so these are just a couple of the curves that we represent for each of these sites. There's dozens of them actually that get computed. But this is just kind of showing how we actually derive those from the gridded data sets or the raster data sets that we're building in tier 1. And then what we're doing is we're really kind of averaging those out over time and getting into these time accumulated metrics. And so this is looking at water years 2009 through 2022. What are the water year, acre days of inundation per acre of parcel size? So essentially this is days of inundation in an average water year over that recent hydrologic period. We can see a lot of this is, a lot of these areas in purple are, more than months of inundation in an average water year, if some kind of connection were to be made to things like these gravel ponds, where a lot of these floodplain areas down in Reach 2A might inundate for a couple weeks to, month and a half or so in an average water year if you were to do things like levee setbacks. We can also look at the same thing for the suitable habitat. So going back to the rearing Chinook salmon habitat, this is bringing in not only kind of the duration of the inundation, but also the quality of that habitat. So it's, these values are slightly lower than what we saw for inundated days, but you can still see some of these areas providing weeks to months of potential habitat for salmonids if you were to make these types of reconnections. And as I mentioned earlier, those are kind of based on a few different things, not just the inundated area, but the HSI or the Habitat Suitability Index with respect to the season, depth, velocity, and duration of flow out here. But one of the main questions we want to think about today with this group is kind of some of the questions that this tool is trying to answer in terms of recharge. And I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to what we're doing here, and then Michael's going to give more detail about it. But ultimately, we're trying to solve a couple of these questions about, when is there surface water present and how deep is it out on the floodplain? So we're able to get that from our earlier tiers of analysis and those rating curves and time series that we get out of it. We need to understand how deep the water table is using depth to groundwater gridded data sets to try to understand how much pore space is there available to recharge into. And then what materials make up the subsurface. And we'll talk a little bit about the data sets that we use to try to quantify that. And ultimately, EcoFIP is thinking about recharge in kind of a one-dimensional sense at first, and it's a little more complicated than that. We're starting with surface-driven recharge from that surface inundation, filling up kind of a one-dimensional bucket. But then there's also ways that we factor in things like background recharge rates based on gauge loss analysis. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about those details. But the main point is that we can generate a similar summary map as what we had looked at for habitat and for inundation to look at the feet of recharge in an average water year across many of these different parcels. So again, some of these are ones that are, the gravel ponds are showing up well because, they've been graded down, they would activate frequently, and they have relatively coarse sediments in these areas. And we're also seeing some, potential on some of these floodplain areas. And then this is both a measure of, the aquifer properties, the soil properties at the surface, and the amount of surface-driven inundation that we could get out on these floodplains if these reconnections were to be made. And with all of that combined, we then kind of ask the question, where would be some of the best opportunities for multi-objective floodplain restoration? Where do we have sufficient depths to drive quality habitat and other features of the landforms out there, as well as conductive soils that we could actually promote groundwater recharge with some of this floodplain reconnection. And so this map is kind of taking both of those into consideration, weighting those metrics and saying, the highest ranked sites are the ones that are lowest in number on this scale. So rank 1 would be the best site, kind of in the darkest blue. And, as we go out the color palette up into the reds, those are the lower ranked sites ultimately. And so this helps us inform a portion of the site selection criteria that Michael will talk about for the phase 2 of the project, or what we talk about as tier 3 in EcoFIP. But before we get to that point, I just also wanted to talk about one other application for this tool that we've used, is looking at alternative kind of hydrologic periods. And we want the tool to be able to ask these types of questions of, how is climate change going to affect the amount of salmon habitat available within this system across a 50-mile reach? Or how are reservoir reoperations going to change, increase or decrease the amount of groundwater recharge that we might get at a particular site that we want to look at? And so it's not just about changing the physical site characteristics that we'll talk about in the concept design, but also thinking about how the hydrology changes these connections and how it has changed floodplain connection historically. So this was an analysis that we had done to look at the pre-dam record in the early 1900s through 1930s prior to the construction of the Friant Dam and a series of reservoirs further upstream, compared to a recent hydrologic period, kind of 2009 onwards. And we can see in the hydrograph at the bottom left of the screen here what the effect of those series of dams has been on muting the hydrology from these very high flow periods and prolonged kind of recession base flows into having quite a muted hydrology overall. And the effect of that on the ground in terms of floodplain connection has been that a lot of these areas went from having, more than 2 weeks in a lot of cases of connected inundation on some of these side floodplains to just a couple days of potential inundation in an average water year in many places. So with all of that, I'm going to pass it back to Michael now, and he'll get into phase 2 of the project, which is tier 3 of the EcoFIP tool.
Thanks, Luke. I will take over sharing the screen. And if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat as we're talking. We probably won't have a ton of time at the end for questions, so we can start answering those as we are presenting. Okay, so a common question with any decision support tool is, okay, we've identified a bunch of potential opportunities, but how does that help us actually increase the pace of implementation? So what we've done with our phase 2 of this analysis is thought about priority locations where we've identified opportunities and developed conceptual designs for those areas that can be advanced and revised with the groups that we're working with. So we have a process to develop a library of actions that we take on the floodplain, visit the sites, help refine them with project partners, quantify the benefits, some of which we've talked a little bit about how we do that already, but we do that for both existing conditions and a future design scenario, and then estimating costs.
You just lost Michael.
Yeah, I think so. I can hear you, Megan.
Okay. Oh, maybe he's unfrozen. Mike, you back with us?
I am with you. Sorry
Okay,
about that. I could hear you perfectly. I'm going to turn off my video just in case that is the issue. And Luke, maybe do you want to share the PowerPoint? It might be smoother.
Sure. I think we lost you on this slide still, so it might be good to repeat some of what you were saying here.
Okay, sorry about that. So this step is really to go from opportunities to potential implementation of concepts. So we develop an action of library of restoration actions. We develop initial concepts, and then we evaluate them for both existing topography and for those future conditions, and estimate costs for our concepts. And then we kind of go into the next phases, which is the future of this project, is how do we take those ideas and take them towards a project that can be implemented. Next slide. So our original analysis, we kind of looked at lots of opportunities throughout the whole system, and here we've kind of refined them down to our best opportunities. We've taken out all the areas that don't easily inundate, and then considered some additional metrics like programmatic objectives by DWR and other programs, consolidating land ownership between parcels, and then ranking the best opportunities. A lot of those blue areas were kind of the areas identified in EcoFIP originally, and then we've kind of gone through a process to say, this is where we want to develop projects because we see the greatest physical opportunities there, and also potential opportunities with land ownership. We've focused the analysis primarily in the upper reaches of the river where the state owns a lot of the properties already. Next slide. So defining our actions that we can take on the floodplain, we're modifying the floodplain topography in these areas to potentially reconnect gravel ponds at elevations that are suitable for salmonids so that they're not too deep for predatory habitat. We're creating side channels for potential habitat. And then we're thinking about how we could potentially connect some of the gravel pits as flood attenuation basins. So during periods of high flow, how can we capture some of that water at a specified flow threshold? Next slide. Then we've gone out and we've kind of taken our initial concepts. We went through a passive generating a set, and then we went out into the field and worked with a whole team to refine those concepts. Next slide. And there's when we get into the benefit quantification. So we want to look for both existing conditions and our future conceptual design of what are we actually going to gain by implementing these restoration costs, right? There's a big effort to, get large equipment out there and modify the floodplain. What are we going to get for that? So we quantify the changes in inundation, habitat, and recharge. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the recharge piece of it, because I think that's where an area where we really want to work with groups like the Flood-MAR network to improve what we can do. And it's a really large effort because there's a ton of limitations. So the biggest one, I think, is the hydrogeologic conceptual framework for a lot of these areas can be a little bit limited. We don't have a perfect understanding of subsurface. Current groundwater models are defined at kind of a really large resolution where they don't have a huge focus on the riverine systems. And they're also spatially usually refined at a monthly resolution, whereas that's not really useful for rapid floodplain inundation. There's also just a lack of monitoring data for observed events for floodplain recharge that we can use to calibrate these things to. So those constraints are also opportunities for collaboration. We will be talking about using airborne electromagnetic mapping, AEM, as a toolkit to hopefully refine the hydrogeologic conceptual models in the future. We are hoping to integrate more with surface groundwater models that are resolved at daily time steps. And I think it's really important that in the future, there's more field observations of direct recharge so that we can really show the benefits of these projects. And I'll get to the next slide. So how we've defined recharge in kind of our simple framework is what Luke described. This is the kind of first step is how can we calculate recharge based on our acre days of inundation? And we basically multiply that by the limiting recharge rates using hydrologic soil groups. It's a little bit simplistic, but we're just using the limiting saturated conductivity and the days of inundation to say when you get water out on the floodplain rapidly, how quickly was water going to move vertically through the subsurface? And then how much spaces are available? How much pore space is available beneath the site? So to calculate that, we take the specific yield. So that's a measure of the amount of pore space within a particular soil, and we multiply that by the depth to groundwater by the ICONS data set. But we're missing a couple things with this, and that's what we'll cover in the next slide, which is our background recharge rates. We know from looking at several gauges along the river that the San Joaquin is a losing reach along these stretches. We lose a couple hundred CFS if you go from Friant down to Gravelly Ford, which is the farthest down gauge that we show. And between each of these gauges, broken up between those colors, so the red, yellow, green, and blue zones, we can actually calculate how large our losses are between those rates. And what we see is that we can account for the diversions between those reaches and evapotranspiration, with the resulting losses being recharge. And we can take that and actually use the EcoFIP tool again to normalize those loss rates to the amount of inundated area and come up with unit loss rates in feet per day. So if you incorporate a new area in the river in these particular reaches, how many feet per day of additional recharge might you gain? And that's what we've added in as a background recharge rate. So we first fill up the floodplains really rapidly using step A, that last process. And then once it's full of water, so maybe there's been water on the floodplain for a month, it uses these background loss rates, which are much lower. And that's how we've accounted for it in this process. But we're hoping with some of these newer models and data like the AEM data, we'll be able to improve that in the future. Next slide. Another part of this analysis we've developed is estimating construction costs. And we do this by primarily looking at the amount of gravel or material we would need to move in our restoration design. And I'll show what that looks like a little bit later. A lot of these unit costs comes from a technical memo created by DWR, and we try and account for construction contingencies, revegetation, and long-term O&M. And I'm going to go a little bit quicker through these next slides because I really want to get to the project concepts. Next. So I mentioned earlier, we developed a set of initial draft concepts. These are them. And if you go to the next slide, we will see some of the final concepts as we refined them, dropped a few concepts, and added changed their boundaries a fair amount. So what we're showing in these kind of conceptual designs is what kind of modifications we're making to the floodplain. So we are specifying through this analysis what elevation we want to grade these areas down to relative to the river. So we can specify at the upstream inlet of the channel. I don't know if you want to point, Luke, to the upstream inlet. We're saying that we are grading that area down to 1,000 CFS, whereas for these lower areas, they would activate a different flow threshold. Really, you can specify anything with these DAM modification tools. So we have a concept where we would connect this large gravel pit to the river with several side channels, which would be activated at ecologically significant flows. If you go to the next slide, what we can do is model what it would be like for existing and future conditions. So this area is primarily not connected to the river right now, so the current or EG inundation is fairly minimal. Where the FG or final grade or future conceptual design, we have dramatically increased the amount of inundation, habitat, and estimated a volume of recharge that is fairly substantial for this area. The one part of the concept I didn't mention is these flood attenuation basins. So these large gravel pits are massive. Several of them hold a couple thousand acre feet. And what we are saying with that concept is that at 4,000 CFS, which we specify, we would connect that area with a fish screen to prevent stranding, to allow water to be captured in those pits and recharge and percolate slowly into the aquifer. Next slide. Another thing we can do is look at the amount of material that would be needed to be moved to create this concept. So we are quantifying the volume of cut and fill, the volume that's moved, and from that we are estimating the project costs that would be associated with this type of restoration project. So you can see in the inlet and outlet, there would be a lot of grading through the material, and then there would be fill material in a lot of portions of the pit to bring it actually up to an elevation that wouldn't be too deep or kind of stranding habitat. And from that, we can kind of come up with a construction cost estimate and use that to weigh, is the construction cost worth the benefits that you're going to gain from this type of project? And we'll go over one more concept, then we'll kind of try and finish up pretty quickly. So just we'll go on to the concept. So this is another large pit, and historically it was connected floodplain habitat. And this whole reach of river, it would be great to bring back to more of a functioning system where we have riverine processes happening, sediment transport, deposition. And right now it's a lot of kind of deep water, slow moving habitat. So we have a concept to reincorporate an area of floodplain habitat and create a large flood attenuation basin for this area. And we're able to model it and show the results. And for this one, we actually see, if you go to the next slide, that for existing conditions, there is some inundation because part of that area is connected as a large pit that's too deep, connected to the San Joaquin directly right now. But under future conditions, we're actually increasing the amount of inundation, habitat, and recharge overall. Okay, we will wrap up in the next couple slides. So we also calculate the construction costs associated with that. And we are really interested in this area because the state already owns a lot of the properties, and this area of the river is heavily degraded. It's a series of gravel pits that have been captured. So what our team's been working on more recently is how do we think about these floodplain concepts within channel work to improve this reach of river that's roughly 5 miles long. So we have several concepts to improve these areas, and we're thinking about if you're to put them all together, what would that look like? How could that improve this system of the river to try and bring back natural processes to the river? And if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. So the state is going to be flying AEM over this area, fine scale AEM, so we might get a much better picture of our hydrogeologic conceptual framework. We are working with a lot of the groups in the area and kind of trying to talk about what these concepts might look like, and we're using these toolkits to kind of illustrate how that might occur. And pretty soon we will be releasing our story map, where we're going to try and make a lot of this data accessible, the parts that we can share privately, and capture this research effort on an online platform. And then there's a couple areas that I mentioned that we're trying to advance some of the concepts and consider the in-channel processes as well. And then I think where we want to leave it is that, we think this process was really useful to identify opportunities, develop designs, kind of filter through them and advance ones that kind of come up to the top as the best opportunities. And we think this process is really useful, and we're applying it in a couple of other areas. But we have our last poll question where we wanted to ask you if there's any river systems or areas where we think this might also be beneficial. So if you want to go to this Mentimeter, I don't know if Megan wants to pull that up. You can open that link on your phone and suggest a river or up to 5 rivers where you think this process would be useful. And I think we're nearly at time. So I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and we will be here for much longer if there's questions, but I don't want to cut into the rest of everyone else's day. So thank you so much for joining us.
Michael.
Thank you, Michael and Luke. Megan, do you think we have time for one question? I saw a question from Joe in the chat that we might be able to tackle pretty quickly. Joe is wondering, are the gravel pits still currently being excavated, or are they retired? And how quickly could some of these strategies be implemented? And I paraphrase, sorry, Joe.
There's a little bit of active mining. Most of them have been retired and the land's been purchased by the San Joaquin River Conservancy in most cases. So there's lots of opportunities to modify them.
Great. There's also some conversation in the chat about costs and state funding. Where I think these projects are really exciting is the amount of partnerships and multi-benefit opportunities that this work and implementation of these multi-benefit floodplain projects provides. Allows for leveraging a lot of federal funding. And after this year, we're definitely going to see hazard mitigation grant funding, building resilient infrastructure in communities, America the Beautiful Challenge funding. There's sources available in pretty significant pots that this type of work will leverage. So even though we may have lost some opportunity for state funding, there's some big federal pots that I think this work would really lend itself towards going after. That's why partnerships and collaboration are really important for this type of work.
Kiamir has a suggestion in the chat of overlaying floodplain restoration and recharge opportunities with land repurposing. I think that's a fantastic idea and something we can illustrate at least how river connectivity can be overlaid with those opportunities. Yeah. Well, thanks again, everybody. If we don't have a June LunchMAR, maybe we can bring this topic back for time for questions. But I appreciate everybody's time. And again, Michael, Luke, great presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michael and Luke. We'll post the video to the FloodMAR.org website, but Jenny indicated in chat that we can share the slide deck on the network SharePoint site. We don't currently have a space on the new FloodMAR Network Hub website for posting these types of materials, but if you're looking for more access, you want to study some of the slides that were shared today, reach out and we'll help you with that.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.